Hello everyone, I'm Rebecca Keppel. In today's video, I'm sharing a technique that I like to call partial alcohol inking. In one of my previous alcohol ink videos, I shared how I like to keep alcohol inking kind of clean and simple, if that's even possible. So for partial alcohol inking, I really like to keep the ink to a small portion of the cardstock. But I know that a lot of the Yupo papers and special alcohol ink cardstocks can get really expensive. So I'm going to compare using the same technique and same colors on a special alcohol ink cardstock and on some materials that you may have in your stash. So I'll compare Yupo paper with photo paper. I'll compare transparent Yupo paper with Vellum. And then lastly, I'll do one partial alcohol inking on acetate sheets. So let's dive right into some partial alcohol inking on Yupo paper and photo paper. So you can see I have several different types of alcohol ink Yupo paper, and I'm going to share using those as well as using alcohol inks, and the storage tray that I like to use I will link to down below. I don't have a ton of alcohol inks, I have enough to be dangerous. So let's start off with the 5x7 white Yupo paper. This is alcohol ink cardstock. It's actually not paper, it's kind of a plastic formulation. I'm working on a glass mat because it's easy to clean alcohol inks off of, and I'm starting with a Pearls alcohol ink and then adding some regular alcohol inks onto it. And you can see I'm just working on part of the cardstock at the top, adding some more colors, and I'm really just letting the alcohol ink do its work. So in the few seconds in between colors, I sped up the video so that you could see how quickly the alcohol ink really just kind of blends itself together, moves around, creates really beautiful backgrounds. I just personally, when I create an entire piece of cardstock like this, it gets so busy that I can't do anything else with the card. So that's why I wanted to try this partial alcohol inking technique, because I feel like it leaves lots of white space for the eye to rest, also gives you room down below to put your sentiment. You could even put a die cut or stamp and color a flower and place it down there. Lots of different options because you have all that room down below. The metallic that I'm using is the sterling alloy, which is that silver color. I love the alloys. I have mixatives as well, and the mixatives are awesome too, but the alloys are just kind of my favorite. I like how you can combine them with the color and they create this marbleized effect, and I'm not really doing anything else to this other than dropping down, and look at that silver alloy that is just doing its thing. Okay, so that looked great. Let's try it on photo paper. So this is old 8.5 by 11 photo paper that I bought years ago at like Costco or something, and I haven't really used it. So I cut it down to A2 panels, and I'm dripping the same colors of alcohol ink onto it and trying to let it do its own thing. But the alcohol ink definitely doesn't move on its own as much on the photo paper. So when people say that Yupo paper is really meant for alcohol inks, they weren't kidding. They weren't just trying to sell you some special cardstock. It really does work better. However, I have this blower tool that I can use from Holtz to move those colors around, to force them off and around the cardstock panel, and that actually looks, I think, really cool too. So, you know, if you don't mind having to do a little bit extra work to create the panel, then your photo paper is fine. And I feel like at least I'm using the photo paper now, so I don't mind doing some extra, forcing the color around. I just think that if you are truly looking for that alcohol ink look of it doing its own thing on the paper, you want to stick with the Yupo. If you don't mind those kind of little splattery looks that I got from forcing the color around with air, then the photo paper is fine too. And you know what? Both are great. I think they both came out really pretty. I like both of the color combinations because it's the same color combination. I am using a splatter brush here to kind of go along with those forced splatters that I created, and that is a good way to make it look purposeful, I think. So you can see the difference. There's definitely a smoother look, kind of an oceanic look to the Yupo paper with the alcohol ink, and more of a splattery look to the photo paper. Now let's try that same technique on transparent Yupo paper and vellum. So it's actually called translucent Yupo paper. And again, it really is so super smooth. It doesn't absorb anything. It just lets those colors slide around and do their thing, blending together, moving, creating movement in the image. There absolutely is a real beauty to how the Yupo paper works with alcohol inks. So this time I'm going to do a pink color combination, and instead of the sterling alloy, I am going to add some gilded alloy this time. Like I said, you can use mixatives here. I am just going to drop in a few drops of the gilded alloy. I really, like I mentioned, like these because of the marbleized effect that is super easy to create with these. So basically all I do is drop them down in a couple of places where the alcohol ink is pretty heavy, and then I use that blower to move them around just a touch. Once you squirt it with a little bit of air, it starts to reactivate and kind of move itself around through the alcohol ink and create that marbleized effect, which I think, especially, gosh, this gold with the pinks is gorgeous. Let's try the same thing on vellum. So I am using Simon Says Stamp vellum. It is a pretty heavy duty vellum without being so thick that you can't see through it. It's obviously still a nice translucent vellum, but it definitely, more than the photo paper, allows you to get that same movement as the translucent Yupo paper. So I'm just dropping in the color. I'm not moving it around. I'm letting it do its thing. You can see I've sped it up a little bit at the top there, and it is just sliding through the different colors and kind of blooming out. You know how they call that in watercolor, it's like when it blooms, it creates that really pretty effect. So I did add a little bit of air to that last one there because they were just kind of drying too quickly and combining into like a blob effect, and that's not what I was going for. But check out that gilded doing its thing up top there. The only thing is I don't really like those strong circles. I want it to be a much more organic look, so I did again add that little bit of air to move those around, and just it also helps to dry them a little more quickly. So if you have kind of a puddle and you want to dry it and move the color around, that blower is really handy. So the translucent Yupo is on the left, the vellum is on the right, and again, the Yupo does seem to have a smoother look to it, but I really like the way that the vellum moved it around as well. Lastly, let's do the same technique on acetate. You can use any acetate that you want. I'm using Judican's embossable window plastic because I plan to heat emboss my sentiment on top. So I am going to leave that like thin piece of paper behind it so you can see what I'm doing a little bit more easily than if it were just the piece of acetate. I'm going to again start with some alcohol ink pearls. I absolutely love those. They're gorgeous. I tend to make a bit of a mess with them. I don't know why, but I think sometimes I don't shake up the pearl enough and it kind of clogs the nozzle, and then I squeeze too hard and I squirt it out. So don't do that. Really shake it really, really well before you take off the cap. And I'm also going to use two different colors this time. I'm going to use some oranges and I'm going to use some yellows. This was a lot of fun to create actually, because it does move around quite a bit on that acetate because it is so smooth and it is not absorbing anything at all, really. It can't absorb into that plastic. So you can just kind of have fun with it, and I'm only working on a portion of it just like I did with the other ones. That's going to leave me a lot of room to do things underneath. Like I said, I do want to stamp my sentiment on here. I did end up adding some of the gilded alloy again, just tapped a few drops in 3 different areas and then used the blower to move it around. Just remember to use some type of blower like this to move color around and not a straw so that you don't end up inhaling any of the chemicals that you're using. So I took the paper off there and I noticed I had a little smudge of yellow at the bottom, took a little bit of antibacterial, placed it on a cloth and rubbed it away. Now let's turn all of these backgrounds into quick cards. For the acetate background, I'm going to use the Stamp Market's Cosmo Cluster stamp set. Although this time I'm not going to use the flowers or the stencils, I'm just going to use a sentiment that says, just a little hello to brighten your day. I'm also going to use some pattern paper from their Hocus Pocus pattern paper set. And it's this beautiful orange that I thought would go really nicely behind the acetate. Of course, with the acetate, you could create a shaker card with it and this be your window. I decided for this one, I just wanted to heat emboss and layer that inking over the pattern paper. So since I'm going to heat emboss, I'm going to use tons of anti-static powder where I'm going to heat emboss. I'm going to use some embossing ink to stamp that stamp. And once that's done, I'm also using my Misty because acetate makes the stamp slide. So a good stamp positioner is very helpful here. And you can see that the anti-static powder really works, even though it looks like all of the embossing powder is sticking. Once you tap gently on the side, it all falls away, and then you can heat set it. And this, especially this acetate, can be heat set. I still am careful, but I don't have to be so careful because it is meant to be heat set on. So I just put some tape runner behind the alcohol inking and a little bit behind the sentiment. I know I can hide a little bit of it back there. And then I'm just going to layer this alcohol inking and heat emboss sentiment over the pattern paper. And I just love how easy it was to create this very unique design. For the rest of the cards, I'm going to be using the Best Wishes stamps and dies from the Stamp Market. And there are a bunch of beautiful sentiments in here. So for each one, I'm going to use a different sentiment. For the first two, I am going to stamp them in the Stamp Market's black ink on white cardstock and then line up the dies on top. They're very easy to line up, as you can see, and just cut those out. And then I'm going to use some liquid glue from Thermoweb, the Ultra Bond in the pen, to adhere these down to my blue panels. And that is just so much fun. I love all that white space. So for the last set of cards, I am going to stamp and heat emboss in gold embossing powder on some pink cardstock because that will mimic the gold within the pink in the alcohol ink. So I treated that cardstock with anti-static powder, then brushed some away and stamped it with the Stamp Market's emboss ink. And now I'm just pouring some gold embossing powder on both sentiments and then just heat set those. And I just love the look of this gold on top of the bright pink. I'm going to use the dies and hold them in place with some tape to cut them out. And once again, I'm going to use that liquid glue. I like that pen form. It's really easy to hold. This does take a few seconds to dry, especially on these non-absorbent papers or surfaces that we're working on. So I did put an acrylic block on top to hold them in place. And again, with that vellum, I just placed some tape runner behind all that alcohol inking and behind the sentiment and added a few enamel dots. These I decided to place on pattern paper, just like we did with that acetate. And I think they are so much fun. All of these, I had a blast creating them. I didn't get stressed out because I did leave lots of room for white space and for sentiment, so I didn't worry about where I was going to place the sentiment or anything else, and then just added some enamel dots for some dimension and shine to the top. So I think they kind of still look clean and simple, even with all that fun alcohol inking on top. If you want to see another video with alcohol inking, check this one out over here. As always, I want to thank you so much for spending time with me today. Please stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll see you again soon. Maybe not. Okay, never mind. There's like a ring. It's the whole thing. The whole thing. On a oh, okay. So